President Gustavo Petro named Richard Gamboa as Director of Religious Affairs. If you practice a religion in Colombia, you should be concerned because you don't know what's coming. I'm going to give you some interesting facts about Richard Gamboa, things that almost nobody knows. And by the way, it goes without saying that if Gustavo Petro is giving you honors, that's the first red flag that you're doing things wrong. In broad terms, this Richard Gamboa is a guy who sees himself as Jewish and bought a rabbinical title online for $150, and you can buy it too. In fact, just out of curiosity, my dog Firulais also has the same title as Richard Gamboa. We'll look at this detail later so that you too, dear viewer, can buy a rabbinical title like Richard Gamboa or like my dog Firulais Ben-Chihuahua. Here, Richard Gamboa displays his title he bought online for $150.
Granted by the Rabbinical Council of the Interreligious Esoteric Theological Seminary, which Frudia, here the rector of the seminary signs she is Reverend Katya Romanoff.
For those who say that Firulais Ben-Chihuahua, by the way, I don't have a dog, Firulais doesn't exist, you pay $150 and a reverend signs your rabbi diploma. But the reverends were Christians, right? I want to show you a bit about the autobiography that Gamboa writes about himself. The first thing is that his original name was Ricardo Rodriguez Gamboa. If he was born as Ricardo Rodriguez Gamboa, why did he change his name to Richard Gamboa Ben-Eleazar? Well, he changed his name because of Father Eliezer Salesman, who, by the way, was a priest accused of abusing children. Here we go.
We're off to a bad start, changing your last name to that of a priest who abused children. Besides boasting about being a rabbi, Richard Gamboa also claims a degree from La Salle University.
Let's take a look at his thesis from La Salle University. The thesis is called The Catholics of Hebrew Tradition in Latin America, written back then when he was still Ricardo Rodriguez Gamboa. I'll leave the link in the description so you can access the La Salle thesis yourselves. You can contact them. Most of the thesis isn't about Hebrew Catholics and all that, but rather about Richard Gamboa. In other words, about himself. Ricardo Rodriguez writes a thesis about himself. Richard Gamboa, his two personas, writing about himself. Ricardo Rodriguez Gamboa writes the following in his thesis acknowledgements. I want to especially thank the esteemed rabbis, Alfredo Goldschmidt, the Chief Rabbi of Colombia, and Richard Gamboa Ben-Eleazar, Chief Rabbi of the Benediction, for their kind attention and collaboration. That is to say, Ricardo Rodriguez Gamboa is thanking Richard Gamboa Ben-Eleazar, but Ricardo Rodriguez Gamboa is the same person as Richard Gamboa Ben-Eleazar. Is he thanking himself in his own thesis? Ricardo Rodriguez Gamboa writes that Richard Gamboa used to go to the Adat Israel synagogue when he was young. How strange. Because Richard Gamboa, in his autobiography, remembers his Christmas events. He had a completely Christian youth. Did Richard Gamboa visit a synagogue in Colombia as a youth? You can contact the Jewish community of Colombia, which has already issued a public statement, and they are completely disassociated from this Richard Gamboa. Richard Gamboa didn't attend the synagogue?
The only brief period when Richard Gamboa went to the synagogue was a little over 15 years ago when he went to convert to Judaism. But when he ran into the major obstacle involved in that, Richard Gamboa simply created his own liberal and independent Judaism. In other words, he created his own Judaism.
In Colombia, the law protects religious identity, so you cannot deny someone their religion. For example, if someone identifies as Jewish, you cannot say they aren't, as that would violate the law. Richard Gamboa takes advantage of this kind of law, because who can deny him if he feels Jewish? Colombian law protects him. So Richard Gamboa, overnight, can identify himself as Jewish, and that's how the law works in Colombia. Let's keep reading the thesis to see how Richard Gamboa became the rabbi.
Richard Gamboa writes that the Lord spoke to him with an audible voice, telling him he was destined to serve as a rabbi, not alongside the Messianic Jews, but with the Catholic Church. Richard Gamboa writes that he wanted to be a rabbi of the Catholic Church. Have you ever heard of rabbis in the Catholic Church?
Gamboa goes on to write that the Holy Spirit told him that the rabbinical ordination had to be administered by a Catholic priest of Jewish origin.
We can already see that it was the Holy Spirit who told him to become a Catholic rabbi, and now we're going to see how the Holy Spirit tells him to take the name Gamboa Ben-Eleazar.
So, he added the name Ben-Eleazar, son of Eliezer, from the house of Aaron. Why? Because the Holy Spirit had revealed to me, says Gamboa, that Father Salesman, whom we already saw, was this pederast who abused children. Father Salesman and I descended from the Jewish priestly caste. He tells him, you are a descendant of Aaron, the brother of Moses from the Exodus.
If I weren't a legitimate Jew in that line of descent, they wouldn't have accepted me at the Interreligious Theological Seminary in Gatsby, Florida, to graduate as a rabbi.
It's not exactly like that, because even Firulais Ben-Chihuahua, my dog, well, I don't have a dog, he's an imaginary dog, also has the same title that Richard Gamboa has. And Firulais Ben-Chihuahua doesn't have lineage all the way back to Aaron, Moses' brother. I'll demonstrate how easy it is to buy this title by showing David Giddis, an influencer on X, purchasing it himself.
On this website, they offer different certificates for pastor, for rabbi, so I decided to learn a bit more, to go through the process and get a rabbi certificate. A process that took me only a few minutes. Anyone can do it if they have a credit card and are willing to pay $150 for the rabbi certificate and an additional $7 for shipping by mail. I made the payment, and sure enough, a few minutes later, they told me I was already a rabbi, and a few days later, I received my rabbi certificate in the mail, which is right here.
Let's hear Ricardo Rodriguez Gamboa's defense.
I graduated as a rabbi before the Beit Din of an interfaith theological seminary in the United States. The liberal and independent Jewish movement does not seek recognition from any other Jewish community. Our own recognition is enough for us. That's why we have our own rabbinate, that's why we have our own halakha, and we don't go knocking on the doors of any other Jewish community asking them to recognize us. Now then, this is a certificate of membership and designation that was issued to me by the Free and Independent Rabbinical Council of the Americas, which is the Beit Din, the rabbinical court that I depend on. I'm even properly credentialed by the Beit Din. The important thing is that there is documentation that demonstrates several issues.
First, he was the founder of Independent Judaism of the Americas or something like that. In other words, he creates an organization to say, look, I'm backed by the organization that I created. In fact, I have an ID card, a card that was given to me by the organization I created. How can anyone refute me? And the thing is, we can't refute Rabbi Richard Gamboa because he says he was ordained by the Esoteric Interreligious Seminary of Gainesville, Florida. There it is, look it up on the internet. There's no such seminary. It's as if I bought myself a medical degree for $150, and since I'm not recognized by the Ministry of Health, what I do is open the Independent Association of Doctors of the Americas. The Association of Doctors of the Americas gave me an ID card and a certificate I printed myself. Now, I'm a doctor.
And I should clarify that this Richard Gamboa, to get where he is now, didn't do it because of his interreligious work. He did it because of his hatred against Israel. Because let's remember that Gustavo Petro hates Israel.
Remember, many ministers and officials in Petro's government have left because they disagree with all the stupid things the government is doing. And that's why Gustavo Petro has to promote everyone who aligns with his anti-Semitic ideology. The funny thing is that this post that Richard Gamboa himself made confused the Palestinian flag with the Sudanese flag. He doesn't even understand the cause he's supposedly supporting. The Sudanese flag, from a country in Africa, a completely different region, has different colors. He doesn't even understand what he's doing. And I haven't even mentioned that he's part of the MUN religious sect. I'll show you that another time. I'm going to make a much longer video showing more and more details about who this Richard Gamboa is, because in that video I'll show you things I haven't shown you yet, and they're far more serious. So don't forget to look for us on the Philosophia Judia page. You'll see the full video on YouTube. And as I told you, if you practice a religion in Colombia, I'm sorry to say that what's coming is very serious, but I have a hopeful message. If Petro is no longer in power in Colombia, then all these people who were just put there as decoration will also fall. I send you greetings from Israel, standing strong because lies always fall and the truth always triumphs. All the best, Shalom.